Sure.
We are recording.
So last we left it, there was the issue of democratic member control and member economic participation that I think Jonathan and Barry, have you guys had a chance to delve into that in the meantime?
I have not.
I've been embroiled in a number of other things.
So in the notes here, we say that democratic member control must be researched to author final language on this, and economic participation tied to business model must be researched for final language. My recollection of the conversation was that there might be some changes to the business model. That Barry, you were in conversation about.
I'm involved in an extended monologue about the business model, but in parallel, I think there's a more officially sanctioned conversation going on that involves multiple people whose job it actually is to worry about this stuff. And so I think we just have to wait until we hear from them.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a fair characterization. I would say that the business model is currently in flux and will take weeks to define.
Okay, what about number 2? I remember, Jonathan, you had some thoughts on the language here.
I'm rereading. That was so 1 week ago. The one member, one vote will be true for certain aspects of the business, regardless of the business model. But there may be weighting for certain other aspects or certain other business models or certain subsets of aspects of other candidate business models. So that was my hesitation, the one member, one vote.
In the line before that, it says men and women serving elected representatives are accountable to the membership. RChain cooperative members have equal voting rights, but it doesn't say voting rights for what purpose. In other words, it could be that they are voting for elected representatives, board members. It doesn't say that they're voting on what it is they're voting on.
Yeah, my concern was that I didn't want one member, one vote to be construed as being representative of every decision process within the co-op. That was my real concern. I'm fine with one member, one vote staying in there because it's in our existing language. That was my caveat.
Yeah, and I think the challenge was that we had discussed the potential compromise of saying RChain cooperative members have equal voting rights for electing representatives, and then we realized that's true, although it's a little bit more complicated. That could imply a set of things of which not all would be true based on the current bylaws, but I think it would be close enough that one could reasonably say RChain cooperative members have equal voting rights for electing those representatives.
Yeah, I think that's good because that will remain true.
They do also have voting rights for voting on initiatives. It's not just elected
Well,
representatives. Is that not true? I mean, when we have a general meeting, there are issues that will be voted on. Is that not true?
Well, what do you mean by initiatives?
I'm not exactly sure. I don't mean specifically initiatives proposed by the membership, but I imagine, for example, if there are changes to be made to there could be issues that we voted on by the membership. I don't know specifically what they are.
Yeah, there was a number of issues in the last member meeting that were voted on by the members, and I don't think the majority of them were voting for board members. Maybe it was, but there were other issues, including the Rock to Rev process. And also they had an issue on burning rock, where the members voted to burn rock, but they didn't say how much.
Well, in my mind, if this is a principle does not mean is actually a policy. It means that we believe that our memberships have equal rights, one member, one vote. It doesn't say specifically for what that is, but that you try to create the circumstances where things of importance are democratically voted on. I don't think that every co-op thinks that every single thing is voted on.
Right. Okay, I'm fine with it as it is. Look at that, a thumbs up. No giant centipedes.
Okay, so then I'm just gonna say resolved.
Good. So I thought that we might look at the values from the poll and talk a little bit about the extent to which they are, in some sense, already covered by these 7 principles, and otherwise what it might look like to elucidate principles based on them. Is that on other people's menu?
I do, but so because, I brought this up a little bit before, and because we have a situation where we have a set of 7 principles already given, I'm looking at the function of these documents, and we have these core values, what we considered here, of which we can decide which ones are RChain specific. But one of the thoughts in having what is a guiding principle is that it has to function within the co-op as a heuristic function. In other words, it has to be something that people can call up as a rule of thumb, as an idea that will be able to clarify and allow them to make decisions on their own in a given situation. And from the framework that I worked on in the past, that these should have elements of an idea, which is a rule of thumb, or it could be, and it should have some form of narrative and emotion attached to that. Now, when we have these set of core values, which we have fleshed out with a certain amount of language and narrative, and they can act in a similar fashion. In other words, when we hear collective intelligence, we know that this could either be, you call it a principle or core value. It's both for us, that we want to encourage policies and ways of operations that put collective intelligence as a priority. Now, how we use this in terms of calling it, embedding it in our principles document, or keeping it as core values as guiding, that I think should be our first decision, because we already have this set of principles. I worry that we're going to create this like extended bunch of stuff that people aren't actually going to look at, right?
Got it.
So
I feel that principles of the principles that relate to collective intelligence and decentralized organization are absent, and they're important to the cooperative. And I think we need to include those in some manner. And
so when
Well,
you say
just looking at these now, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, John. Go ahead, Barry.
I was just going to say, looking at these now after looking at the others for a while, it strikes me that we already have a draft of something somewhat semantically equivalent to the other principles, right? I mean, we've already, these definitions that we put in place with some change in sort of how active the language is, to go more from like passive as they are now ideas to something more active or practical, basically turns these into principles fairly equivalent, I think, to the others.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think that that we're just talking about titles now. When you call it a core value, or I mean, some people basically say their guiding principles are their core values, and their core values are their guiding principles.
Sure.
So I guess it comes down to, in calling something a principle versus a value, it comes down to what degree policy will be derived from it. And if principles are the elements that actually guide behavior and are created to be referred to guide policy, then I actually think your core values should be the things that guide your policies as well. So I'm actually with you 100% on that. It just matters of fleshing out the language, and if we want to change the title of this, like, do we want to call these RChain guiding principles and versus co-op principles? Do we want to call these? I mean, that's where it comes down to what's going to be functionally understandable for most people.
Right. That's a good point.
But Jim, what you're saying is that under this collective intelligence, you believe that there should be additional principles that elucidate this concept. Is that what I'm understanding?
yeah, I guess I'm not terribly prepared to come up with principles that elucidate these values, but you know, I'm thinking that there needs to be some. I think there needs to be some effort to go through the patterns for decentralized organization and the collective intelligence best practices and incorporate them. I'm not sure they can fit under.
Well, maybe one thing we could do is say, so we adapt our processes so intelligent groups exceed that of the greatest individual intelligence, and we adapt our processes for collective intelligence best practices. Is there such something out there? I mean, it's not like we have to have policy.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, and conforming it with the others could literally be RChain Cooperative adapts its processes so that the intelligence of the group, you know, it endeavors to yada yada. That's a start, I think.
Jim, is there a collective intelligence best practices guidelines somewhere that we could refer to?
Well, there's, you know, I guess there's a number of things that are being done in that area, and you know, most of them are somewhat specific. I mean, certainly the Inspiral 10 patterns of decentralized organization could be included. I have a collection of best practices that I put together. There's a lot of books that advocate different aspects of working out loud, of hierarchy and sociocracy and things that strive for maximizing collective intelligence, which is not best individual solutions. It's solutions better than the best individual that is the measure of collective intelligence.
Okay, I just added this line. I'm just as a placeholder for this idea. We incorporate best practices for collective intelligence in our operations. No? Yes? Change? Edit?
Well, I mean, just following the grade school rule that you don't include a word in its own definition, we could say we incorporate best practices so the intelligence of the group exceeds that of our greatest individual intelligence, or some rephrasing of that that gets the point of what we mean by collective intelligence across.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Dictate
We
to me.
adapt our, okay, so I would invoke the sentence prior. So the clause generate solutions better than the best individual solution. So RChain, Cooperative, adapts processes, yada, yada, yada. It incorporates best practices so that the group can
Intelligences.
that's tough. Either seems fine. Singular might feel more natural, but probably either way is okay.
I didn't get beyond that.
Oh, so where it says we incorporate best practices for collective intelligence, I would just replace collective intelligence with something like we incorporate best. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's okay as it is. I was just thinking we incorporate best practices to ensure or to increase the probability that the group generates solutions better than the best individual solution. Either talking about the outcome or, you know, talking about the process, except if there's like 17 best practices, we're not going to list them here, but if there's one or two things that tie them together, then it makes sense. So like we incorporate best practices to ensure that
well, I think
every
like a hot link
voice is heard or whatever. I mean, it's not exactly that, but
Yeah, I would say, I wouldn't, I think it's redundant here to say operations. I would say interactions, because that's really where the collective intelligence starts, is in peer-to-peer interactions and group interactions. And
well, I think that if we had
impose collective intelligence on the group, it has to come from within.
So, for example, Jim, if you had a document which had best practices for collective intelligence, that could be a hot link in here so that there's actually a document which states best practices otherwise, there's no point in saying best practices because we're basically repeating what we said the line before, right? We adapt our processes so the intelligence group exceeds that of the greatest individual.
Well, why don't we say practices shown to enhance collective intelligence? You know, it can be
well, I think there should be a link
you
here.
could just say practices. You don't even have to say best. Some people get nervous about the notion of best practices as they're applied in business.
Well, but if we're going to have a document that we want people to use as a guideline, like, for example, I think we should post a link if you have some guidelines for some people who are starting out in the co-op may not be familiar with these things. It would be good to have incorporate what we consider best practices and post a link for it. I mean, that makes sense to me from a practical point of view.
Yeah. Then I should update that. This is the one I put together for the governance forum talk. Which I put the link in the conference in the.
If we were going to change these to be principles versus values, we could change the title of this to have it be a directive. Enhance collective intelligence, that's wrong. Promote collective intelligence, or we could just leave it.
Yeah, I mean, some of these that might be nice to sort of honor somehow because they're a little more concrete, at least, would be sort of synthesizing opposing views, I think, soliciting concerns and objections. I think working out loud is kind of interesting. It might overlap a little bit with probably a lot of these overlap with transparency, not all, but some, depending on what it is that's transparent. I mean, I think the difference between transparency with and without collective intelligence is the stage at which the transparency happens. So if the decision is made and then it's explained, that's transparent. But if the decision making is transparent and inclusive, maybe that's where they come together. So
that would be down here under transparency, right? Or to me, transparency is an element you need to have successful collective intelligence.
I agree. I mean, I also think you need it for an effective democracy. I mean, obviously, there have been some questions raised in this call and last week about exactly what the ongoing evolution of that democracy might look like. But regardless, like, even if you're electing agents to represent you and you're handing them complete power, you can only hold them accountable by understanding what they're doing and how. If you don't have an understanding of what they're doing or why they're doing what they're doing, then your right to vote is meaningless because your vote is completely uninformed.
Right. You need the information.
So, I mean, I think this a lot of this revolves around, I guess, these questions of sort of what is the set of interactions that we're thinking about as we're trying to define in a more action-oriented way how these values are realized in our community. And, you know, I do think I think they all interrelate, and they all strengthen each other. So I think integrity is also something that facilitates, like transparency facilitates integrity, because when the norm is for you to be open, you don't even think as much to try to get away with just glossing over something inconvenient, because that's not really an option. And I think that facilitates integrity, because it's like integrity becomes the cheapest path, right? It's like, instead of the path of least resistance being a little white lie, which potentially balloons over time into something, you know, really troubling, it's sort of like having the norm of transparency and having a constituency that it has sort of the maturity to enable you to be transparent, facilitates integrity. It also facilitates, you know, sort of the democracy and so on. So I do think these things all kind of work together, and maybe in some sense what they all culminate in is collective intelligence in practice, because that's sort of the virtuous outcome of having these open and honest interactions in a large and diverse network where all of these different people are, you know, interacting person to person or in small groups or whatever. But since they're not siloed and they're not sort of in opposition to one another, the best possible outcomes percolate out of that structure. So I guess I'm just saying, I think it's a nice set of values that we picked. That's not really advancing the discussion on how to clearly articulate them in a way that's going to communicate this reasoning to a general reader. But I think we are already practicing a lot of these things. And so it's about kind of describing it in a way that makes it clear.
I would disagree. I mean, the bounty system, well, I guess compared to what? But there's a lot of chaos going on. And that doesn't bode well for us as we scale if we're not applying these. Now, what I've been working on, if we can take a slight diversion here, I'll put a link in the chat to guiding cooperative work norms that I've been collecting. And this was meant to be describe the behaviors that are required, that enhance, that are consistent with the patterns of decentralized organization and collective intelligence best practices. But what I have in the document first is I got from the bounty system itself, which is what what somebody coming into the system is presented with. And independently, then I came up with a set of general norms that apply to cooperative organizations, decentralized. Things like we work, play, and learn together. We learn to guide ourselves. Some of these things are covered in our principles already. We seek guidance and guide others.
So,
we work in small love.
Jim, I guess like one question that really pops into my mind instantly looking at the norms you laid out is that, and actually even before looking at it and hearing your comments about chaos and us scaling, I've been sort of perturbed in the past about bogging these conversations down in unsolvable issues where there are disagreements that seem pretty durable. But I think a pretty crucial one is what it means to scale and whether that's desirable or exactly what is desired. So like this whole worker co-op, consumer co-op tension to me is like scaling the bounty system, scaling the co-op as essentially people working together to produce things is a completely different destination than scaling a membership that is coming together to sort of guide some elected or employed representatives who are themselves doing the work or contracting out the work or making things happen. And so, I mean, I think there's a really deep tension there that keeps popping up and is really problematic for, figuring out how we do what we need to do. But it seems like for anyone involved in the co-op to figure out what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, if we just consider the decision processes, okay, and we are an organization of people that are trying to make decisions about that are going to help RChain reach its objectives in solving the problems of the world. Now that's, I guess, another can of worms. But it seems very clear to me that the direction of the leadership, whether or not we allow, or capitalize or use the members of the cooperative to do part of the work or not, is something that the members need to decide. Okay, and so in order to make decisions that exhibit a collective intelligence, we need to have norms and behaviors that enable that collective intelligence. Otherwise, we're not going to make good decisions. So,
well, so, I mean, all of this is, both of you are correct. I mean, there's a certain amount of chaos. There's not a decision about what is actually happening in the co-op. But I go back to, have any of you read the branding document that just came out? The Gervin Brandy document? It's worth a read. Patrick posted a link in the branding, and it has, it goes through all of the interviews they did with the leadership and and the people. And, you know, I guess what I have to say is that despite all of that, the way I look at, you know, from a practical point of view, what we're trying to do is we are trying to create a set of ideas and norms and practices that people can access when they first become members that will enculturate them and allow them to interact and get up to speed with our process. And those of us who are working within the cooperative hopefully will have a set of internal guidelines, touch points having to do with both our values, our core values, along with our principles to allow us to navigate this chaos on our own, right? Because the whole point is that we are out here trying to do this, and we need those internal guideposts to keep us moving forward. So, I mean, and back to what our guidelines were, is that we need to have these principles and guidelines for making decisions, for onboarding new members, and for having inspire people to go forward. So I think, you know, if we focus on that, then, you know, the other stuff we kind of have to put to the side because there's nothing resolved there.
Well, maybe it's possible to write these things in a way that applies in either scenario, but let me just sketch out what I see the two scenarios looking like. One is, look, there are people who are members of the co-op and they're interacting with the co-op intermittently. You know, they maybe attend most of the member debriefs to kind of hear what's going on, maybe not. Maybe they just get an email newsletter. You know, when there are certain big issues, they might jump onto the Discord because those are a particular concern to them. They give feedback to officers or board members through different channels, but with the view of, hey, have you considered this? Or why did you decide to do this? That doesn't make sense to me. But the locus of control is clearly invested in a set of people, and the collective intelligence emerges through a pattern of distributed people talking to each other. Maybe the three of us have a conversation and then we go to Kenny and we say, hey, Kenny, we were talking and we thought of this. Have you considered that? If it seems important. But ultimately, that resides in Kenny's hands. And if he can't explain the decision he ultimately makes, then we eventually vote someone else into office or whatever. So that's one model. The other model is we're like meeting multiple times a week. This is a part-time job or hobby for people. And I think that's really when people are talking about, is this a consumer co-op or a worker co-op? It's like, what is the nature of the relationship that you have in your life with the co-op, and what are you doing? Are you doing work as a member? Like right now we're doing work. And I think then we have people popping up and saying, like, this isn't the point of the co-op. And so then it's like, okay, well, we're in this bootstrap phase, so we're doing these things. But then once we have principles, we dissolve our working group and, you know, the co-op no longer needs us, or we move on to another thing. Versus in the other, it's like, yeah, well, we're working on this now, and there are going to keep being more and more things to be worked on because the whole point of the members is to do work. And those are radically different visions, I think, for the co-op. And I think collective intelligence applies in both cases. Transparency applies in both cases. All of the values apply in both cases. But how they're applied, as I see it, is very different in the context of those two very different types of participation models.
I agree with you, Barry, but I think, I mean, that for me is one of the reasons why it doesn't behoove us to necessarily craft really specific principles right now, that having core values
Got it.
that are descriptive, that we could use as guidelines for policies down the road, can be adapted to the functions of those, whatever the policies can be designed to the functions that come about to be decided to be the best thing, but they will still use these as their higher goals. I mean, I think some of
Yeah,
the
I agree with that. I agree with that. And I think, I mean, I think you can see this even in the discussion of member economic participation, where we bump into this wall of, okay, technically we've already signed on to this by way of being a co-op, but we don't have the clarity necessary to add that specificity, which frankly is kind of bizarre. And I think it's a symptom of this weirdo cryptocurrency boom, that you can create an organization that has like a $400 million reserve of internet money it's sitting on, and doesn't have the ability to tell you in 50 words what the purpose of its existence is a strange phenomenon that would probably not exist at most other points in history.
Yes, it is a grand experiment. I think you're pointing out.
But I mean, I guess the question is just, I mean, it sounds like we fundamentally agree. I just don't know what the implication is exactly for what we can do. Like a week ago, I was thinking, let's just assume one of these visions and then craft the principles as if we all agree that that's the vision. But I'm not sure that we all even necessarily agree with the vision, or that we know where it comes from. Like, you know, one approach is kind of capitulate to the word from Ian and company and steer in one direction. And the other is to kind of say, no, this is a democratic institution and the people want something else. So let's presume that we're building that on behalf of the people. And I feel that those are two very different paths. And I think you're saying let's not even go there, but.
Well, I guess my point is that even if you're Coca-Cola, you still have a set of, potentially a set of values or core values or guiding principles that you, that your organization wishes to believe in, adhere to, and aspire to, right?
Sure.
So,
but you also have a perfect understanding that in your ecosystem, you have customers who drink beverages, you have suppliers that produce ingredients, you have employees who do whatever you tell them to do, and you have shareholders who you have a certain kind of accountability to. And like, you know, I assume that the common understanding of that fades into the background as so completely obvious. And then you take your values and the wording is sort of built on an implicit understanding of that backdrop. Whereas, you know, the challenge here feels like we're not sure if the cat in the box is dead or alive. And until we open up the box, it's hard to specify the values because we don't know which implicit backdrop we're engineering them for.
I see what you're saying, but I guess for me that whether we're a consumer co-op or a worker co-op, I mean, if you look at the ICA co-op principles and values, they spread out throughout all different sorts of co-op. And I looked up I was looking at websites that had to do with, you know, healthcare co-ops, you know, electrical utility co-ops, and down to food
Mhm.
co-ops. And they each have a completely different function, but there are certain attributes that they all adhere to, aspire to, of which we are
That's a great point.
do as well. So I guess I'm at the feeling that that side of things will get worked out. And there are obviously groups of us within the co-op that have a high commitment and interest in realizing, you know, decentralized governance and decision making to promote collective intelligence in the co-op, and others who perhaps that's not so important to, but I do think that having a vision, having a set of, like, you know, higher ideals that we aspire to, that we can use as a rule of thumb, would apply no matter what we are, unless what you're suggesting is that people get all excited about being something that we're not. Like, maybe that's what you're saying, that maybe we're really are a consumer co-op, and in which case, why are we talking about all this stuff to do with collective intelligence?
I think the first sentence in the marketing doc says it opens it up pretty clearly if I can get back there.
In my mind, if we have these set of, I mean, what we call them, whether we call them, you know, core values, guiding principles, whatever we call them, if it's a touchstone for us as a co-op, no matter, as our organization, then it will be something that people will try to manifest. That's my thinking.
Yeah. You know, Greg talks about why it should be a cooperative, and how we get we certainly get our guidance from our leadership, and we get tasked with things that the membership should do at at many of the debriefs and through other channels. You know, we don't say, well, we don't do that because we're not a worker cooperative. I think that that, you know, we have organizational issues, and we're not doing the things that the co-op puts in our hands well because of organizational issues. I know there's some pushback in terms of the community being incompetent, but that's not a reason to not do the work. It's a matter of getting our act together and doing it well.
Jim, I don't read it that way. That's not. I think there are two things going on. I think one thing is, oh, there's malfeasance or people exploiting the bounty system or inefficiencies, so there's that set of complaints about the bounty system itself. But I think behind that, there's also a view that might be basically, it doesn't matter if it were working well or not. That's not what this is set up for. So, I mean, in my mind,
what it is set, who are you talking about, first off, and what are they suggesting we're set up as?
Well, I mean, I think the precedent in other blockchain projects is that you have a foundation or you have a corporation. And the issue is there's some entity, for all of the blathering on and on about decentralization, which is aspirational in some ways. You, at least at the beginning, it's clearly aspirational because someone has to build the thing. Someone has to make the design parameter choices. Someone has to get other people excited to adopt the technology. You have to bootstrap this whole operation, even if you eventually manage to pull off the trick of getting decentralized, which there seems to be some precedent for actually accomplishing that. Regardless, at the beginning, and in some cases it seems to be indefinitely, there's a role for some centralized bodies. And so the question is, should that be a corporation? Should that be a foundation? Or should that be another type of entity? And I think the idea of organizing as a co-op is a way of bringing a different governance structure to the decisions that would otherwise be made by, say, an RChain foundation, the job of which was to steward the ecosystem or bring developers into the project or coordinate on core development or other things like that. But organizing, like replicating the Ethereum foundation in the form of a co-op, to me, does not necessarily in any way imply something like members are doing the work. It could be there's a core group of people who are doing the work, but within the context of an organization that gives a lot of power to another set of people who are the members to hold accountable that core group of people, as opposed to some foundation that basically ensconces a group of people in permanent power, right? So those are very different than each other. Having sort of a table that Greg and Nash and 7 other people sit around to make decisions about everything forever, with any feedback from the crowd sort of at their convenience, is different than having a structure where their seat at that table, at least nominally, but I would say probably hopefully in practice, is sort of at the pleasure of the membership. So there really is accountability. There is motivation to hear the voice of the community on various different issues and govern in a way that earns another vote to sit at the table again, or earns some new person a seat and displaces an incumbent that the members didn't think was acting, in the best way. I understood that to be the counterfactual, i.e., the foundation model or a corporate. In the corporate model, there's a company with shareholders, and they hold on to part of the token supply, and the idea is to make the shareholders rich by either selling services, separate from the blockchain, like consulting on how to use it, or just causing the tokens to appreciate so that the original shareholders make money. And I think the idea of the co-op in this case is to sort of get away from both of those 2 other counterfactuals. but not necessarily to sort of be the change.
So what you're saying is that if basically we're talking about co-op members as having a structure for voting rights versus taking part in the actual day-to-day.
Well, voting.
Yeah, exactly. That's the tension that I feel between, say, you know, how Alan talks about things, how Jim talks about things, versus, say, how Ian talks about things. And then other people kind of occupy some ambiguous space. I mean, you asked, where am I hearing this? So just to disclose, like, you know, the way Greg talks about it sometimes seems ambivalent on the two. Like, it's not entirely clear which thing he's suggesting is the thing that we're trying to do here. Other people seem to take a stand that's much more explicit. This is what we are, or this other thing is what we are. But that's the tension that I perceive.
Yeah. And, you know, I think, you know, that, you know, there's an idea that we're doing one thing or the other. And there's no reason we can't do both things. There's, you know, no reason to exclude members from activities. Now, obviously, part of decentralization is dividing up the pie, dividing up the responsibilities, having domains where there are people who have authority in those domains, and Greg advocates this. And this was, you know, his mandate to us in the governance conference was to empower people to do things and to act and to be part of the process, that this is a revolution, that we are doing something new and different. And, you know, we're not following the old models and old paradigms. We're creating something new here. And you know, I think that, you know, some people are myopic in their thinking. They say, well, we have to just do this or just do that. Whereas I think Greg and others have an idea that, hey, if we can scale, we can do everything. We can solve the problems of the world. Okay, and it's a grand vision, and not everyone sees it, and that's okay. They can work in their domain and have authority in their domain without looking at the big picture.
Well, I would say one thing, that no matter what the structure ends up being exactly, the fact that membership is open and you pay $20 to be a member, and also, at least currently, transparency to me is like the ultimate value that's actually being expressed that is unique about RChain. The fact that, you know, with the weekly hangouts and being on Discord and actually being able to see what is going on, and having Reflective and Pythia and everybody else, you know, talk about what they're doing. No matter what ends up being, that is, I would say, unique. And is, I don't know where things are going to, and I think Jim, you're right, that there's both going on at once and it hasn't been figured out yet. I do believe that the more we can attract other people and the more that people have a way in of taking part, I'm not sure that taking part has to be in the bounty system and doing work, but the more people are excited and included and have ability to engage, and all of the principles having to do with education, as well as our values, transparency, collective intelligence, I think they all speak to that. And whether the chaos and the decisions about which way we're going to go or the other, I would hope that these elements of the co-op remain, which is the fact that we get to be part of it and see what's going on, the transparency, even if my ability to actually, even it doesn't mean actually doing work, I still see that as creating an identity for ourselves that is embodied in our values and our principles. And that is what, one of the big things that attracts people to RChain, aside from the tech and the possibility. But I also think, Barry, that you're right in that one of the things that also freaks people out about it is the kind of sort of chaos that's going on. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jim described it as chaos. I wouldn't disagree, though. I wouldn't disagree, although I will say more troubling. Well, yeah, I don't know. I guess how concerned one ought to be about that might in part hinge on which vision you're sort of buying into. But I don't know. I mean, I think Jim makes some interesting points about how one might think about that.
Well, in terms of what we're doing here, I feel that I'm not committed to actually specifically having detailed principles, but I do believe that we should flesh out and deliver the detailed principles, co-op principles that are geared towards RChain, because that's important. And the more we can flesh those out, the better, because they speak to our specifics of our democracy. I also believe that whether we call these core values or guiding principles, the more we can flesh these out, our list here with more details, and have this as some deliverable document, that it will be of value. How we choose to have it incorporated in the onboarding process and so on and so forth, that has yet to be seen. But
yeah, I agree with that. I mean, to me, I think there are three options: kind of polish what we have and publish it, adopt a stance on what we think the co-op should be, and then write the principles, additional principles, or clarify the principles further to accord with that view, not take a stand and kind of duplicate the exercise which is kind of an interesting thing, to say basically, well, here's what we think the principles look like under this model, and here's what we think they look like under this other model. Maybe that's a waste of time. But I think those are kind of the three options. And probably the middle option is off the table, because we already talked about that and didn't sort of jump at that. So I think it's sort of like, in fact, let me put it this way. Maybe what we want to do is polish what we have and add comments that call out where we think the tensions lie, as we have done with the member economic participation, and pass this along to the leadership, to the rest of the members, and say basically, this is as far as we can get. There are some really important fundamental decisions that are TBD, and until those are resolved, this can't be finalized. And I don't know that anyone needs to be reminded that there are outstanding questions, but maybe it's useful to have another way to get at that point of like, look, there are questions that kind of need to get resolved.
well, I'm of the feeling that if we flesh out what we have, I don't think that defining which way the co-op is specifically going to be organized is an impediment to using these for guiding the co-op, except for some of the specifics in the part about the co-op principles. I guess I'm of the mind that if we have, I guess we have to decide how we want to title it, how we want to flesh out the language, whether we call these guiding principles, core values, what we call them in terms of how we flesh these out. I do think since we spent a certain amount of time and effort elucidating this from members, that it would be good to deliver this as a set of whatever you want to call them, values, principles, that from there down the road, then no matter what version we end up being, the principles and policies that could be derived from them could be customized to fit that situation.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So maybe, I think the only thing, I'll have a little bit of time next week, maybe other people could do, but maybe people could go back in and just like revisit language in here and add edits or things that they might want to do to that end before we take the next step. Because I think we're close if that's the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think a touched up version of this document with some appropriate prefatory statements for context is probably the deliverable for us.
I second that.
Jim, you're muted.
I stuck in the diagram under decentralization there just for reference for now. But I think if we were to somehow, if you scroll down, oh, where are you? Final value. Scroll down a bit, Karen.
Oh, okay.
I think if we were, they certainly overlap with other values and principles, but I think that they would create a, well, what is this? Do I have to answer? Hello?
Jim has decentralized himself a little bit too much. Jim, come back to Central.
I'm sorry, but this diagram, all it does is confuse me, and I'm not sure I want it in this document.
Yeah, you can take it out, but I'll take it out.
I'm not really sure I understand it, to tell you the truth.
You didn't watch the video, huh? With Inspiral?
Well, if you need a video to understand this, then it shouldn't be here.
Yeah.
I'm happy to watch the video, though. I mean, I'm familiar with some of Inspiral's work and the Lumio guys. That,
yeah. I think that I don't know what's happening.
I mean, Jim, maybe rather than including the diagram, including some of the things that you see when you look at that diagram, like if you're looking at that and you're thinking something that is not coming through to us because we lack context, if you could tell us what that is, maybe even with you referring to the diagram for inspiration, but with us not even looking at it, maybe those are the things we want to include in the document.
Yeah, I suppose just a list of them.
Before we go, can you guys can you only see this link? If I change another one, do you see that? Or are you still
I
seeing
see
the
that.
Okay, so I just want to
Do you
show
want to
you.
drop the values into the bottom of the principles so there's one document, or do you want to create a third document that brings them
No,
together? What do you
I
think?
just want to keep them separate for now until we're done with them.
Okay.
But I just thought, well, you guys should read it on your own. But you guys should read the branding document, the Gervin. Have you read that?
I looked through it. I didn't read every word in it, but I think I looked at a lot of different interesting pictures and some of the words.
I got through a good part of it. I'm not sure how much I have to go.
Well, there was, so let me just see if I can. The only reason is that there's one part of it that I really thought was interesting. Let me see if I can bring this up. If it will open for me. Is it not going to do it? No, it's not going to do it. Okay, forget about it. But there was a section under competition, or the second section, where there was, I'll post it in our little chat, but there was some really interesting language, and some of our values kept being repeatedly brought up that were touch points in that document. And I just really liked reading that to get an overview of things. So anyhow, I don't have it at my fingertips, so never mind.
I can't
You
find.
know, I did have the same observation that it seemed that a lot of the words that we've been throwing around were recurrent themes in that document as well. Probably not an accident, since I think our work on the values was one of the inputs to that process.
Well, and the same people were giving their inputs, so.
I put the link to the document in there. The word competition isn't in it.
You put the link to the document?
I think I have the right document.
You know, it might be in an image. It might be in an image, Jim, because I think it's, or maybe competitor is in there.
Oh, yes. Oh, here, I can bring this up. Let me go. It might make too much. The Who, community co-op, blah, 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 blah. Well, in any case, they had one sheet where they were describing.
There's like EOS and other things. I think there were some pages on other projects.
Yeah, and then afterwards, right after that, there was a little thing they posted, which here it is. Okay, teams commentary, outcomes. This I thought was a really interesting statement here. This one.
We don't see
You're
it.
not sharing that part of your screen.
Oh, how do I do that? We go to stop
Yep.
share and share again. Stop share.
Yeah, and either share your whole screen, desktop, or share what you want.
This was a one little piece out of the entire document that kind of condensed some internal, external thoughts. So anyhow, I just thought it was there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why this was under competition. Maybe it's because it's talking about the floundering out there. And it just goes back to the idea of the thing that makes RChain is part of the thing that we're working on. So anyhow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, my takeaway from the branding document mostly was a positive feeling that, okay, this branding document is describing the organization that I thought I was getting involved in a positive way.
Yeah.
And it's the ones that we want, right?
Yeah. Although telling, right, that it says it's open to those that are willing to commit to the build, which is not the same as it's open to those that are willing to commit to build.
Right. That's very much a developer coder speak. The build.
Well, yeah, and it's a noun. It's not a verb.
Oh, interesting.
I mean, one of the things under team commentaries perception is hyper collaborative. I would assume that would apply to the co-op members as well, but
well, guys,
one thing we know is there's plenty of outstanding questions that might be above our pay grade in some senses. Our principles and values working group hasn't probably been charged with taking on some of those bigger questions. So shall we commit to reviewing independently the document, adding some comments, tweaking some words, and maybe the goal of our meeting next week is to sign off on it and then post it?
And we should also consider how many of our unique core values we wish to use, which would be in addition.
That's a good point.
In addition to, so we should have a think about that, in addition to the ones already elucidated by the co-op values. So, all right, guys.
That's a good point.
Get some feedback on where the cutoff is.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks, guys. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye, Jim. Bye, Karen.